Welcome to American Pulse. This episode I consider it to be very special because I wanted to talk to you about American Pulse program and where did I get the idea and how did I proceeded to have this program put together. So, being an Egyptian born, a very loyal Egyptian citizen and a very thankful American citizen, I hated to see things falling through the cracks between two of the biggest powers in the entire world, and one of the very most faithful and truthful ally to the United States, Egypt. So I'm really hoping that things were not done intentionally, but it seemed like that the U.S. government was supporting and backing up the Muslim Brotherhood regime. And it's either because, and I repeat that I'm hoping that those were wrong reports given to the State Department by the locals about who was supposed to be in power in Egypt, and I think America went ahead and shook hand with the Muslim Brotherhood. And I don't want to go in details in that because this is behind our back. I think the relationship has been a little better than 1 or 2 years ago. So I wanted to be very proactive and I wanted to do something to help Egypt while I'm here in the U.S. And at the same time, I'm very thankful to the U.S. for giving me the opportunity and the chance to succeed and prosper in the land of dreams. So I first thought about having a newspaper, and then I decided to do the program because I thought the best thing that could happen and the best thing that can relay the message is conversations. A lot of times we see that there's problems between countries, and the main issue is the miscommunication. Everybody is thinking to himself of certain things and not sharing those thoughts with the other country or the other individual, and there's a lot of assumptions. People assume things on the other people's plates and vice versa. So I figured that having a conversation with the actual American media people and decision makers, senators, state senators, and congressmen, and foreign ambassadors and former ambassadors and politicians would be the best thing to get to the core of the problem. So I remember it was a week before the election when I met with Dr. Herb London and Miss Judith Miller, the journalist. Dr. London was still is the president of London Institute for Policy Research, and Judith Miller is a Fox News contributor. She's a journalist, she's a book editor, and she just had actually launched one of the most recent books about her life story. And why I'm saying this because I want to explain how we thought about the program idea and how did we proceed after that. So we talked about the election, and I would like to recite part of this interview with Dr. London and Judith Miller, so I'll let you watch it. But it seems like you have a very extensive knowledge about the Middle East.
I have been covering the Middle East for roughly 30 years. And I think that one of the problems is that because Americans have been exposed to at least 2 wars in the Middle East in the past 30 years, they think they know a lot about the Middle East, but actually they don't. And they've gotten perhaps the wrong impression, because what we do know is roughly wars that involve Arab countries, and of course the Middle East is not about wars all the time.
So, Ms. Miller, from your perspective, tell us how you see the evolution of Egyptian-American relations over the past several years, please.
I think that we are now in a very bad place.
in terms of U.S.-Egyptian relations. It's one of the worst periods I can remember since Nasser, which is saying a lot. And I think that there is a fundamental miscommunication and misunderstanding between the two governments now, and a set of unrealistic expectations on the part of my government, a lack of appreciation of what's happened in Egypt in the past 2 years, and a misunderstanding of what's politically possible and economically desirable in that country on the part of my government. There have been mistakes on both sides, miscommunication on both sides, but I think it's very, very important for the future of Egypt and for the future of our relations, that U.S.-Egyptian relations, that Americans have some strategic patience with the process that's now unfolding in Egypt and is going to culminate in I think, a transition to something new and different, beginning with the elections.
We're so happy to have you with us today.
It's a great pleasure to be with you.
I understand that you just returned from Egypt. Will you tell us about your trip?
I went there under the auspices of my center, the London Center for Policy Research. It was a fact-finding tour. We met with the leading figures in the country. I spent 2 hours with Field Marshal el-Sisi in what was a very interesting and penetrating analysis of American-Egyptian relationships. He's quite a remarkable man, in many ways, quite a remarkable man. And probably the one person in the country who is capable of uniting Egypt at this moment.
Oh, wow.
That's good news. What did he have to say in the 2 hours about his plans and so on?
Well, a lot of it, of course, is dealing with abstractions. One of the things that you have to do is to restore security in Egypt before you can once again engage in the tourist business. There are 20 million people, Egyptians, involved in tourism, either directly or indirectly. And now it's in the hundreds. So obviously this has had a profound effect on the Egyptian economy. There are formidable challenges ahead. Mr. el-Sisi understands that. I said to him that the moment he's elected, his popularity starts to decline because he has to deliver. He is a remarkable fellow and understands what has to be done. First is dealing with the problem of the Muslim Brotherhood. They left a very, very negative legacy that has to be dealt with. And I think the general understands that all too well. And then the second is trying to develop an economy that can find employment for a lot of young people who are unemployed at the moment. The unemployment rate for those under 30 is staggering. And you had 4 million people who worked in Libya. That's no longer possible since Libya is under the control of al-Qaeda. You cannot cross the border. As a consequence, Egypt is facing a very, very real economic crisis. And el-Sisi is the one person who will be given a grace period. He had the opportunity as field marshal to fire on those people who were demonstrating in the streets when 33 million people were out there demonstrating against Morsi. He refused to do so. As a consequence, he became a national hero. So whether you're talking to someone on the left or the right, whether that person is a Copt or a Muslim, they all understand el-Sisi is the one person who can provide leadership at this time. But he has a 1-year grace period. At the end of that period, he understands all too well, he has to deliver. He has to start finding impacts or things that happen in Egypt that lead to some economic vitality.
Now, we came back, now after we watched this, we see that we kind of were predicting the future of Egypt, and we took steps in order to support that. I mean, obviously, the whole world, except certain governments, were supporting the fact that there has to be a change in Egypt, and it had, President Sisi was the most suitable person for that. And it took us hours and hours and meetings and conversations and setting up meetings with politicians and trying to explain to them, and protests in front of the UN, trying to explain to the whole world that what happened in June 30th was not a military coup, but rather an actual revolution where 33 million people went out in the streets. So after that, somehow it was, the terrorist threat has risen like crazy right after the election of President Sisi, and I'm trying to analyze, was that part of the plan to destroy Egypt? Is because I mean we had heard of a lot of terroristic attacks and terrorism over the past decades, but it was never so condensed and consolidated together. So I had interviewed one of the famous media TV show talks, Judge Janine Pirro. Judge Janine was former DA of Westchester County, and she is a TV show host in Fox News, and kind of the time that we're started to hear about ISIS, the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, and things were very little back then. There were about 3,000 or 4,000 people gathering up and forming this group, and we felt the threat right away, so we started to talk about it. And I would let you hear what Judge Janine had mentioned about the ISIS and terrorism in general. I'll give you highlights on that episode. There's a question that is going on in the media. Why does Judge Janine hate terrorists?
It's like asking me why I hate criminals. I mean, I've devoted my life to it. In other words, it's not so much hate. It's like you and I don't care who you are. I don't care where you live.
Yeah.
You want to have a safe family, home life, the ability to feed them, the ability to proceed and pursue whatever dream you may have. I mean, it's the essence of America. The ability to have, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Do you think we're under risk or under potential of having more terrorist attacks here in America, being us ignoring what's going on in the Middle East?
All I know, and do I have intelligence over anyone else? The answer is no. But what I do know is that I think people should live and let live.
Yes.
And when there are people who are dedicated to killing us as Americans, I stand up as an American and I say that's wrong. Mm-hmm. If there are people who want to come here because they consider us to be the infidel, then I consider that a reverse crusade. I think that what's going on is they want to come here because we're the infidels. I mean, live and let live.
But that's not what they have been claiming the last few years. The terrorists and the Muslim Brotherhood and all these sections, they're trying to come close to America and wanted America to support them to gain democracy. So you think...
But America did support them. America supported the overthrow of Mubarak, who helped us get rid of Gaddafi in Libya, and we threw him under the bus for Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood. And it was the Egyptian people who said, we cannot tolerate this, not America.
There's a saying says that keep your friends close and keep your enemies closer.
Yeah.
You think that might be a strategy to avoid the harm of the terrorists? Would that work with the terrorists?
You still want to attribute the best of intentions to people, and I can't say, I can't answer what the motivations are.
Okay.
But I know that the Muslim...
Is it dangerous to bring them closer? That's what I'm trying to get to.
I think in the United States that there's a different feeling about the Muslim Brotherhood. I think that our administration feels that the Muslim Brotherhood hasn't hurt Americans, and they want to integrate them. And I think they need proof that they're here to hurt Americans before they do anything. And that's what America's all about. Free speech, free practice of religion, that kind of thing.
Around the same time when we spoke to Judge Janine, I thought it was a very good idea to meet with a person that was hands-on with, one, American foreign policy, two, major war in the Middle East, and that was Dr. Hamid al-Bayati from Iraq. He was the former permanent representative to the Iraqi mission in the United Nations, and he had shared with us his story about living in Iraq under the Saddam dictatorship regime. He also mentioned that he was imprisoned and tortured at that time in Iraq, and he was able. Some of his family members were killed, and he was trying to explain to me why it was so important that somebody had to come and free the Iraqis from the Saddam regime. But if we notice, and this is the question that I always ask so many people about, was it necessary for the Americans to invade the Iraqi soil? And nobody seemed to agree with the Iraqi invasion, but at a certain point they said it was Saddam was so a dictator and somebody had to put a stop to him. But I really don't know if we had handled this in the best way ever. I think things could be handled much better, and we see other terroristic groups are coming from Iraq with no control. There's no control over this area. So basically, nobody has a correct and straight answer about what happened in Iraq and whether it was a good thing to go or not. I mean, the American administration has had its point, is that Saddam was a dictator, and the rest of the world, the Middle East was in peace, I guess, when Saddam was there. Not saying that I was supporting Saddam regime, but somehow we didn't have any problems with Iran. I mean, basically, we killed the first buffer system against Iran. So I'd like to take you to Dr. Hamid Bayati and see what was his take on this matter. I was wondering if you don't mind if we can open up an old file of yours living in Iraq and how, under dictatorship of Saddam, and what did you think about ruling of Saddam, and then you moving to England, forming a campaign against Saddam Hussein. So if you can talk about that, it would be great.
Well, under Saddam regime, everybody suffered. The Iraqi people, the region, neighboring countries, even international powers, the United Nations. Saddam followed a policy of repression against the Iraqi people, and then he had 2 wars with neighboring countries. Then he challenged the international community by developing weapons of mass destruction, launching wars, repression, etc., etc. I was imprisoned and tortured.
Wow.
When I left the prison, I decided to stand up against dictatorship. I fled the country when they tried to rearrest me, because in the first time they said, we will release you, this time next you will be executed. I left the country, I lived in London. I launched a campaign, media campaign and educational campaign. I had meetings with officials in the UK, in Europe, and even in the United States. I used to travel to New York and Washington twice a year. So all that campaign resulted in Saddam putting pressure on my family. 8 members of my family were executed in 3 campaigns.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Even my mother was forced to be on TV 3 times as a threat to me, with my sister whose husband was executed, and 3 brothers.
Sorry to hear that.
Even after I returned back to Iraq in 2003, I have another brother who was kidnapped and killed. But I said I will face the dictatorship. I will stand against the dictatorship, no matter what sacrifice it will take. Eventually, we managed to see the end of Saddam regime. Now we enjoy democracy, freedom, elections, human rights, rule of law, etc., etc.
How did it feel being in prison, and how long were you there for?
I was a few months because they accused me of planning a demonstration against the regime. It was a funeral for 5 people who were executed by the regime, one of them living in my neighborhood. So I went to the funeral. There was some shouting and shooting and so many things. Eventually they couldn't prove anything. I didn't confess. If I confess for anything, I'll be executed. So I said, I just went to a funeral. I'm not part of a secret organization. I try to prove that I am a part of secret organization which try to topple the regime, and then they will go to their bosses, to the leader, to say, listen, there's a big conspiracy, these people confess, and something like that. Many people with me were executed, so I insist that I was innocent and had nothing to do with politics.
Not that I support this or agree to this, but I hear a lot of Iraqi people say things were better back in the days under Saddam regime, where people that didn't directly interfere with him, I'm talking about the working people and the normal people, not the politicians. And the other thing is, I wanted to know if the U.S. administration would have approached Iraq in a different way. You think it would have been better? Did they do any mistakes? You think going to Iraq was the right thing to do or not?
Well, before Iraq-Iran war, which lasted for 8 years, some people were saying if you don't interfere in politics, you will be safe. So the majority of people, either they kept silent or they go with the regime. But during Iraq-Iran war, Saddam took young people from each single family in Iraq because they need them in the war. It's a long war and it was bloody war. So a lot of people were killed. So almost every single family suffered because of that war. Then 2 years later, after the end of the war, after 8 years, he invaded Kuwait. And when you invade a country, you need, soldiers. So they were grabbing any person in the street, put them in a truck, send them to the battlefront. They could be killed the same day or the next day. So everybody suffered. We cannot say Saddam regime was better.
So obviously, the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood were thrown out of power and Morsi was ousted by the army and the will of the population of the congregation of the Egyptians was still an issue for a group of people that followed the Muslim Brotherhood regime. So and it was still at that time there was like a conflict between whether it's a coup or revolution, or so I still try to talk to people from the decision making in the United States, and also people from average people from the street. So we spoke to Senator Martin Golden. He's the senator for Brooklyn and Bay Ridge area in particular, which has a lot of Arabs and a lot of Egyptians that live there, and he's in daily in contact daily with so many of the Arabs and the Egyptians, and matter of fact, he was talking to us in one of the shows, and he said across from his street was the apartment for the September 11 hijack attackers. So Senator Golden has stated that he had a lot of contact with Egyptians, and he actually mentioned that his office is right across the street from the apartment of the hijackers of the 9/11. So this man can relate very well for the misery of the terrorist attacks that happened in 9/11. So we had to really pick his brain about what's going on in the Middle East and how the U.S. government should deal with the current situations back then. And he had like very deep thoughts and insights about the relationship between the Egyptians and the Americans. And at that time, he was sure, and he kind of felt that things are not going to go bad. It was just a temporary problem, and it would be fixed over time just by the new interim government in Egypt would prove to the whole world that they're not overtaking the presidency or the rule of the country, but just trying to help out the country to go from point A to point B. Senator Golden, you're known to be a good-hearted man and a people man. So when I read a lot about you, and what I heard about you as well, is that you helped a lot of families. You tried to pass bills for tax credits, help elderly people, help the community. How can we now we have a new government in Egypt, and we want the ministers and the prime ministers, and how can those government officials reach out to these people, to their people, the same way you did?
Well, I think you got to be in the streets. You have to go into the towns and the villages, and there's a lot of area like in upstate New York here where it's around. You might not see people for miles. You have to be able to go in there and get the message out and let them know what the message is. The message is about the freedom of democracy, the freedom to be able to vote, the freedom to try to put somebody into office that's going to direct the educational system and give their kids the best education they can get. But most of all, people live in a community for one reason: safety. They want to be safe. If they don't feel that they can be safe and their family are endangered and their children are endangered, they're not going to feel good about that government. And they're not going to feel good about staying in that country. And they're going to look to get their kids and their families out of that country. And that's why you're seeing the influx here, not in just this nation, but in other nations around the world. I think that can be reversed under this new regime and this new democracy, that they'll be able to bring more people back to Egypt. They'll be able to have the growth that they've seen in the past come back again and see that nation being the premier nation that it once was. And I think that's something that's definitely about to happen.
So, Senator Golden, what do you advise the Egyptian government and the Egyptian population to deal with the minority group of the Muslim Brotherhood that were kicked out of power because of many reasons we all know about? We want peace. So how can we pursue that?
Well, I believe that the people of Egypt have spoken. In this election process, they voted for al-Sisi, which has not only changed the direction and the leadership of Egypt, but has also taken the Brotherhood out of its leadership positions. And I think the overwhelming numbers of people that went out and voted for al-Sisi is in itself a recognition that they too do not want these people in power. And I go back again to Ireland, where my parents came from. There was always the North and the South. The North was controlled by the British, and the South controlled by the Irish. So the IRA and the battles with the Irish Republican Army and others went on for hundreds of years. Yes. But it prevailed over time that you have a united Ireland today. They have some differences, but it's a united Ireland, but took hundreds of years to get there. Middle East has been fighting for thousands of years in different areas, but in Egypt itself, we can see that the change that the people demand change for peace, demand change for the future of their families and that of Egypt. So I think they want jobs, they want economic development, they want good education. They want good healthcare system. They want to be able to try and raise their families and stay and live in Egypt. So I think the overwhelming number, the overwhelming support for the new leadership will in fact, you will not see the Brotherhood in power for, I don't think ever. I think that's the end of the Brotherhood.
Now, a person that we met with that would surprise you about how much knowledge he knows and has about the Muslim Brotherhood, Eric Stakelback. Eric is a TV show host in Washington, D.C. in one of the very famous channels, CBN News. And he also is a commentator to different TV, CNN, Fox, and he's a journalist and he writes a lot of articles. He had edited a couple of books about the Muslim Brotherhood, and he actually took the carriage 10 years ago to go to Germany and meet with the first organized group of the Muslim Brotherhood in Germany, which known to be one of the most dangerous group over there. And Eric had mentioned something in his interview that the Muslim Brotherhood are here in America, and I thought that was bizarre. I didn't really think it was that bad, but he kept on assuring that this group is so well organized, and they penetrated the White House, and they penetrated the Pentagon, and they penetrated the Congress, and actually, I kind of, looking back at what he said, everything he had mentioned was fairly true. I mean, I would like you to hear what he said a year ago about the Muslim Brotherhood and how they planning to form the caliphate in the Middle East. And he said so many things that I didn't think it was true, but looking back, it was right on. What do you know about the Muslim Brotherhood?
Well, I can tell you, I think the easiest way to boil it down when we're talking about the Muslim Brotherhood is that they are the granddaddy of them all when it comes to modern Islamic terrorist groups. Without the Muslim Brotherhood, there would have been no Al-Qaeda. Dr. Morgan, every Al-Qaeda leader from Osama bin Laden, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, Ayman al-Zawahiri, before they formed Al-Qaeda, they belonged to the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is really the gateway to terrorism and jihad. And I make the point in my book that without the creation of the Brotherhood in Egypt way back in 1928, there would have been no 9/11. 9/11 would not have happened without the Muslim Brotherhood's influence. As I said, every leader of Al-Qaeda, all of the architects of 9/11 came out of the Muslim Brotherhood. They were raised on the Muslim Brotherhood's radical ideology. And what is that ideology? Dr. Morgan, the Brotherhood's official motto, the creed they live by, still today reads in part, "Jihad is our path." At the end of the day, the ultimate goal of the Muslim Brotherhood is the reestablishment of the caliphate. Now, it might sound like a funny word to everyone at home, but the Khalifa, it's a word everyone should know, because at the end of the day, the caliphate is the goal of every radical extremist from the Muslim Brotherhood to Al-Qaeda and beyond. And what that is a union of the Islamic world, but under radical regimes run by the Muslim Brotherhood, not under moderate regimes, but under radical regimes, uniting the region under one radical ruler or caliph, and uniting the region under a very harsh, strict, brutal interpretation of Sharia law that would confront the West, confront the world. The goal is world domination of this caliphate, and the Brotherhood would be at the head of it.
So you think the ultimate goal is power, not religion prosperity?
You know, the Muslim Brotherhood, in my view, Dr. Morgan, their ultimate goal is political power, domination. They just use religion as a means to the end, as a means to an end. At the end of the day, I believe the Brotherhood's ideology, look, we've had these fierce, destructive ideologies we had throughout the 20th century. We had Nazism, fascism, communism. I believe that the Brotherhood's radical ideology falls right along those lines. Ideologies whose ultimate goal is power and domination. And by the way, under this caliphate, there would be no room for moderate, average, everyday Muslims, like millions and millions of Egyptians. There would be no room for them in this caliphate. There would be no room for millions of Coptic Christians who live in Egypt. They would not be equal citizens. They would be persecuted. We saw the Muslim Brotherhood's true face after Mohammed Morsi was thrown out of office last July.
Yes.
We saw that the Brotherhood went on a rampage, burning dozens and dozens of Christian churches to the ground. This is what the caliphate would look like. It would be constant war with Egypt's neighbors. This was the road Egypt was heading on under Mohammed Morsi, and this would be the ultimate goal of this caliphate. Run again, governed under the most harsh, strict, intolerant, inhumane type of government and type of application of Sharia law.
Now, on the same episode, I was able to meet with Mr. Thomas Cox. Mr. Cox is an artist who lives in Brooklyn. He's surrounded with a lot of Arabs and Egyptians, and he's in day-to-day connected with the Egyptians, and the fact that he likes the Islamic art. He's been connected with people that very religious in the Bay Ridge area, and somehow some of these people belong to the organization of the Muslim Brotherhood, and for that he had been misled with what happened in Egypt, and he was trying to fight for them, which, this is a free country, everybody can say whatever they want. But what I didn't understand, he was shocked to learn about all the killings and all the murders and all the burnings that was done through the Muslim Brotherhood group, and he was still defending them. So I will let you hear that. So you see, Egypt is going towards democracy.
I did, but I to tell you the truth, I have reservations here, because I think the problem with the military takeover is who determines that this was the will of the people. That was the claim of the military, but did they conduct a big poll, or did they?
The 33 million people went out in the street to oust Morsi, and 45 million people went out in the street to put the responsibility of the military to fight terrorism and stop all the damage that is happening in Egypt.
Okay,
so this is the real poll.
Okay. So I mean, this is the contradictory information we get. But at the same time, right away when the military took over, there were more people killed than during the time of Morsi.
Because of the suicide bombers, because of the terrorists that are trying to use the circumstances and make the military looks bad the way.
The predicament that I'm in, and I think the dilemma that many people are in here, is that we hear contradictory information. Now, one of the interesting articles that I read recently, 11 days ago, May 23rd, in the New York Times, there was an article printed on a Pew Research Center poll that was released the day before, which found that the actual popularity of General Sisi was about the same as the popularity of Morsi was 3 weeks, or at least several weeks, before his ouster. So this is different than the way it's being portrayed by the Egyptian military.
Well, Mr. Cox, you're talking to me about an article, and I'm talking to you about an actual footage and pictures of 45 million people in the street. There's no way you can beat that.
I don't know about that figure, but you see, that's what I say. It's contradictory. I don't know how many people were in that demonstration. I just think it's very hard to say, and I don't know where you got that figure yourself, but
it's Google Earth. Google Earth has calculated the distance of where people were standing and per square feet how many people would be standing in that lot, and they figured it's about 45 million people out in the street.
So then at least we have to say that what the poll that the Pew Research Center conducted and this Google that you referred to are contradictory.
What do you say for 23 million votes to El-Sisi out of 26 million?
Well, we know that the Muslim Brotherhood called for
they striked. They didn't.
Yeah, they called for a non-vote. They called
how many of the Muslim Brotherhood, as per the Egyptian government statistics in Egypt, around 300,000 people.
Actual members, but their influence goes much further.
Yes, I agree with you.
Yeah.
I agree with you. But
so, there were problems with, for instance, the banning of that party as an illegal party, and the putting on handing down military sentences to the Muslim Brotherhood. I can't agree with that sort of thing.
Well, if they preach killing of people and they encouraged the chaos that happened in Egypt, and they wanted less stability to the Egyptians, I think the government had to step down and put their foot down and say, enough. Enough is enough.
See, I'm not so sure that I agree with you there. I think that that would be a viewpoint of the Egyptian military. See, I'm really trying to maintain something of a neutrality here.
Yeah, I understand.
Where I'm not going to jump on
But
the
have you heard
bandwagon.
about the killings of the soldiers in Sinai? Have you heard about the killing of the civilians in Egypt? Those suicide bombers, burning of churches. 92 churches were burned. And you can't convince me that Christians who are the ones that burned their own churches. It had to be somebody burning them.
Yeah, okay, we
Right, 92
know
churches.
that, but...
92 churches.
But if you want to
people
jump quickly to saying that you know exactly who's responsible, I think that's where it gets difficult.
Okay. So you want, in other words, you're suggesting that we further investigate? Is that
I
what
think
you're
so,
saying?
and I think...
And that's fair. That's fair.
Yeah, and I think the quick military trials are hard to justify. I think...
No, that's fair. I agree with you on that.
Yeah.
We have to investigate. We cannot just jump into conclusions and assume that a certain section of the populations are causing all the trouble.
Right.
So we want. So you want fairness. You want justice. You want more investigation. But you agree that if they've convicted, they have to face the penalties, right?
Well, if there's a fair trial and if it's...
Yes.
Beyond the shadow of a doubt, that's what we talk about in this country.
Okay.
For determining guilt or innocence. We start with the presumption of innocence.
Sure.
And you have to prove a person guilty. And
It's only fair. It's only
I think
fair.
that's what we should look for.
Sure.
But, if one party is in power and then goes after the other party, that's where the
It gets
problems
tricky.
are.
Yeah, it gets tricky. Now, when we started to think of stronger bonds and relationship between the Egyptians and the decision makers in the U.S., I couldn't find anybody better than Ambassador Frank Wisner. Ambassador Frank Wisner was the ambassador of America to Egypt for 8 years. This man knows a lot about Egypt. He pretty much speaks a lot of words in fluent Arabic. He knows all the areas in Egypt. He's been to Khan Khalili. He likes to eat the Egyptian food, but more importantly, the man is really in love with Egypt, and I asked him a few questions about why Egypt, why do you really love Egypt so much? And he sarcastically saying that if you drink from the Nile River, you'll always come back, but you might get some sort of disease or something. So it's really true, because we don't take care of our Nile River the way we should. But I think now we're starting to realize the problem and starting to think how to protect our Nile River. Mr. Wisner has been called one of the supreme pioneers of politicians in the United States. Mr. Wisner was the one was sent to President Mubarak at the time of February 2011 to give him a message. He never revealed the message to me, but he always made sure to tell me that the message was in favor of the Egyptian people. So I'm assuming that he asked Mubarak to step down. No solid piece of information, but just an assumption. So, and I talked to him about ISIS, and I talked to him about global terrorism in general, and he had fears. He had fears, and he said we must act quick, we must act fast, we must do things to protect this world. And for some reason, we think that the U.S. and the European coalition has not moved fast enough to combat ISIS. It's an issue. It was an issue. ISIS has been growing all that time, and nobody put the stop to them. But I would like to shed the light on that interview, because I thought that was very, very informative, and it was right on, and he really predicted a lot of things that happened. He mentioned things about Yemen, he mentioned things about Iraq and what's happening in the Middle East, and I can see that he had a vision. He was able to see that we're getting into an area of darkness that we're hoping to get out of. But he was always optimistic about the relationship of the Egyptians and the Americans. So let's hear what Ambassador Frank Wisner need to say. You had opposed the American administration to go into war in Iraq back in the days when it happened. Were you prophesizing of what's going to happen nowadays?
Well, I think you exaggerate my views about the past. I certainly believe the United States, if it was going to go into Iraq, had to turn the country back over to the Iraqi people very quickly and get ourselves out of the equation and not allow our presence to further exacerbate the issues that were there. But that's history. Now we're facing a really serious matter. Will Iraq survive as a nation? Will it be dismembered? Will a radical Islamic force, Daesh, control the majority of Sunni inhabited Iraq? Will Kurdistan go free and become independent? What about the rest of Iraq under those circumstances? This is frightening for the dissolution, the end of sovereign, unified Iraq is a threat to all of us. Now, what can we do? There is only one way forward that I know, and that is the formation of a government in Baghdad that brings together the political leaders of the Kurds, of the Sunni and the Shia, and behind a political program that means all Iraqis will be treated fairly. Perhaps in each area there will be a large measure of autonomy, but everyone will be treated equally. And behind that, a determined military campaign to wipe out the dissidents of Daesh. It cannot survive. A stable democratic Iraq and Daesh are antithetical. This is going to require more than just the work of the Iraqi people. It's going to require support from the outside, from the United States, from Iran, from Saudi Arabia, the Gulf, Turkey. All of us have got to get together to help the Iraqis get control of their situation and maintain their country. So there's a big problem ahead of us and real work to be done, but it starts with a political decision that really only Iraqis can take, the formation of a national unity government and effort.
So I started to feel that American Pulse program should have more of a developmental rule aside and alongside with the first goal is to fill the gap between the Americans and the Egyptians. So I thought to myself that if I would use the fact that I live here in the US and the fact that I'm exposed to a lot of things and the fact that I've learned so many things and a lot of connections that could be reached, and bring that experience on a silver plate to the Egyptians to learn from, to copy or imitate or modify or study, to learn, to brainstorm about what things are being done here in the US, which was proven to be successful, obviously, since the US is one of the leading countries in the world. So I think I would benefit the country directly and indirectly. So I started realizing what are the problems that we're faced now in Egypt, and the first one was tourism. You know, in the year 2012, 2013, 2014, there's so many bombing attacks, and there were so many killings and kidnapping, to the point that scared, and the instability of the country, it scared a lot of tourists and actually diverted the tourism flow into Turkey and Japan and other parts of the world, and Dubai. I mean, we appreciate Dubai and UAE, obviously, but tourism is one of the most important industries for the Egyptians. If I'm not mistaken, 12 to 15% of the Egyptian population earn from tourism, and it's a big percentage. When I was back in Egypt last year, and I would go to visit one of the temples in Luxor and Aswan, and I would see tens of people's out of jobs and complaining about no tourism, no money, and people are going bankrupt, and hotels are vacant, and it was very sad, because I've been to other parts of the world, and they don't have what we have. They probably have 5% or maybe 3% of what we have in terms of civilization, in terms of art, and in terms of the weather, and in terms of the beaches, and in terms of everything. But yet we don't have a pool of tourism coming to Egypt, and I can understand for safety, but I wanted to take the initiatives, and I invited a few of the experts in the world of tourism to try to brainstorm to figure out what to do to bring back tourists to Egypt. So I would leave you to hear what we've done on that episode. Mr. Seuss, have you done anything actively to recruit tourists to go to Egypt?
Yes, actually, one of the companies that I worked for, we launched Egypt probably a year before I left, and it was a successful launch. There was a lot of interest in not just the sites, there's a plethora of things to see, but also the culture, the fact that Egypt is an open society in that they're very welcoming and they're very warm. And so this was all very positive for Americans and continues to be. Americans really like to experience culture, and Egypt is a perfect place for that, and for that reason it had great success.
I would say that Egypt is in everybody's bucket list for travel.
Absolutely.
It's just a matter of time. When is the right time to go? And the tour operator or the Egyptian Tourist Authority, it is our role to create the right time for the people. And by creating the right time, the offer, the good deal, because everybody's after the good deal nowadays. Even in our day-to-day life, if you want to buy a tie or a suit, you're looking for a deal. You ask your wife, do you have a coupon or something so I can go buy my...
You want to save something.
Exactly. So nowadays...
With this kind of economy, everybody would like to save anything.
So we have to actually introduce that to the traveler, because everybody wants to go to Egypt. But when I say everybody, I would say at least 80 to 90% of Americans would like to go to Egypt at one time if they have the chance.
Brenda, do you have any suggestions for...
Oh, do I? I'm glad you asked. I actually prepared this is an overview of a marketing campaign. I'm going to be giving Consul Hegazi of the Egyptian Tourist Authority later today.
Yes, we'll have it in the next episode.
I know this will work, but Egypt has to do it. And what is it? It's a marketing campaign. And it starts with a documentary of Egypt. It needs to be made now.
I think there's one already circulating.
There's lots of them made, but we need to have one made now. The ones that are circulating happened long before the revolution. Okay. That doesn't convince anyone. When you show people those documentaries, they say, yes, but what's happening now? Yeah. If you want to attract American audiences, American tourists, you have to have a documentary made by an American speaking to Americans. And not just a Nile cruise the Sphinx and the pyramids.
There's a lot.
You need to go all.
Safari, the
Absolutely.
desert.
Absolutely.
Just hanging out downtown,
Yeah.
mingling with the people.
Cooking, you know,
Yes.
just
Cooking classes.
Yeah, I mean,
Felucca on the Nile in Cairo.
yeah,
There's
just
too many.
Coffee shop, El Fishawi, that's how many hundred years
Walking by
old.
the Nile River at night.
Absolutely.
It's little things, but when you put all of them together, you have
It's a whole package, right?
perfect getaway.
You know, tourism, it has many factors to boost number of tourists. One of these factors was the stable during these days. We had like 3-4 years, we had nothing in terms of incidents, things like this. Also, we had many of new hotels start to be open in Egypt, as well as we call like fashion. From time to time, you can see some of these destinations jump to in the scene as a fashion of the year. People start to really like to go. Also, we have one of these new products in the Red Sea and South Sinai that's really attracting European. For instance, we have daily charter flight to South Sinai and Hurghada, especially for Russian, and we receive like 2 million Russian tourists visiting Hurghada city and Red Sea. So that's why.
They do scuba diving.
And scuba diving. So maybe this is one of the really new product. It's like 15 years product only. Before 15 years, we didn't have such.
We never
a
had this.
No resorts. All of these Sharm el-Sheikh city and Hurghada city, it's only 15 to 20 years old. So we start to have new resorts there, 5-star resort, new service, new product in terms of beach and luxury and product that attracting European individual more. So that's why we increased our numbers of tourists worldwide.